On a stormy night, FBI agent Angela Johnson, exhausted and eager to get home, finds herself being tailed by a police car in a quiet, small town. As the officer Mark Henderson approaches her vehicle, Angela's calm demeanor is met with hostility. What begins as a routine traffic stop quickly escalates into a tense confrontation fueled by Henderson's prejudice. Despite his aggression, Angela remains composed, revealing her FBI badge only after being mistreated. The realization of his mistake hits Henderson hard, and as the rain continues to fall, Angela stands firm, confronting the systemic issues behind his actions. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Angela Johnson navigated her way home on a dark, stormy night. The torrential rain cascaded from the heavens, creating a relentless downpour that blurred her vision and made the road ahead nearly impossible to see. She was bone-tired after a grueling day at work, and all she wanted was to get home to her family. Tonight, however, she was not in her FBI uniform, but rather dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, blending in with the other residents of this small, sleepy town. Despite her high-profile career, she looked like just another commuter on a rainy night. The town she was passing through seemed deserted, the streets empty and eerily quiet. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain on her car roof, a constant reminder of the tempest outside. As Angela drove, an unsettling feeling began to creep over her, an intuitive sense that something was amiss. Her heart quickened as she noticed a pair of headlights shining ominously in her rearview mirror. A police car was tailing her, its red and blue lights flashing intermittently in the darkness. Angela's grip on the steering wheel tightened involuntarily. She had done nothing to warrant a traffic stop, but she was acutely aware of the potential implications of being a black woman in this particular town. The police car inched closer, its lights growing more intense as it pursued her. Angela's mind raced with questions and concerns. Why was this officer following her? She hadn't exceeded the speed limit, and she wasn't engaged in any illegal activity. Nevertheless, her anxiety mounted as the police car positioned itself directly behind her. Her thoughts flashed to her FBI badge, tucked away securely in her purse. Should she present it to the officer to assert her credentials, or would that only exacerbate the situation? Angela was torn between pulling over to explain her identity and continuing to drive in hopes that the officer would eventually abandon the pursuit. The rain seemed to intensify as the tension inside her car escalated. The blaring of the police siren cut through the night, signaling that she was expected to pull over. Angela's stomach churned with apprehension. She knew she had to comply, but the fear of the unknown made her hesitate. She took a deep breath, attempting to steady her nerves. Despite her experience in high-stress situations, this felt uniquely daunting. It felt personal, and that realization frightened her more than any physical threat. With a final, apprehensive glance at the police car in her mirror, Angela slowly steered her vehicle to the side of the road. The street remained desolate, and the rain continued its relentless assault, adding to the sense of foreboding. As she brought her car to a halt, her heart pounded in her chest with a mix of fear and anticipation. The flashing lights of the police car created an ominous red and blue glow that cast eerie shadows across the darkened night. Angela felt a shiver run down her spine, acutely aware that this was no ordinary traffic stop. Her instincts told her to remain vigilant. As the car came to a stop, Angela took another deep breath, trying to quell the rapid thudding of her heart. She watched through her side mirror as the police car came to a stop behind her. The driver's door swung open, and Officer Mark Henderson emerged. Angela had heard troubling things about Henderson. He was known in this small town as a hardliner with a reputation for discriminatory behavior towards black residents. There were murmurs of his unfair treatment of individuals who looked like her, and it was widely believed that he often made their lives more difficult than necessary. Henderson's footsteps were heavy and deliberate as he approached her vehicle, his presence commanding and intimidating. Even through the torrential rain, Angela could discern the stern set of his face and the hand resting near the holster of his gun, a clear indication that he was not here for a casual conversation. Angela's fingers gripped the steering wheel, and she made a conscious effort to remain calm, despite the mounting pressure. She had encountered officers like Henderson before, but the experience never seemed to get any easier. Reaching her window, Henderson tapped on the glass with his flashlight. Angela rolled it down, allowing the cold, damp night air and the cacophony of rain to flood in. "License and registration," Henderson demanded, his tone sharp and filled with hostility. Angela nodded, her face composed as she reached for her purse to retrieve her documents. She moved deliberately and with care, striving to avoid any sudden motions that might provoke him. As she handed over her license and registration, she met Henderson's gaze squarely, maintaining her composure and hiding the anxiety she felt inside. Henderson yanked the documents from Angela's hand, barely taking a moment to skim their contents before turning his full attention back to her with a fierce glare. "What exactly are you doing in this town?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You don't belong here." His suspicion was palpable, his tone dripping with hostility. Angela felt her heart race, a jolt of anxiety shooting through her. Despite this, she forced herself to remain calm and composed. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. "I'm just passing through," Officer Angela responded, her voice unwavering and steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm heading home after work." She hoped her straightforward explanation would diffuse the situation, but Henderson's narrowed eyes and hard expression suggested he wasn't buying it. "Work, huh?" he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism and derision. "And what kind of work do you do?" The way he sneered as he asked made it clear he doubted her claim, as if he found it impossible that she could have a legitimate job. "I'm an FBI agent," Angela said firmly, trying to project authority without sounding boastful. She didn't want to flaunt her position, but she hoped that revealing her occupation might prompt Henderson to ease up. However, rather than softening, Henderson's demeanor seemed to intensify. "FBI, is it?" Henderson scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a good one." His mockery was evident as he scrutinized her appearance, his disdain apparent. "What's an FBI agent doing out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? Do you think you can just flash a badge and get away with anything you want?" Angela's jaw tightened as her patience began to fray. The way Henderson was treating her as though she were a criminal only fueled her frustration. "I'm not trying to get away with anything," she said, her voice now tinged with the frustration she had been striving to suppress. "I'm simply trying to get home." Henderson's expression hardened further, his face inches from hers as he leaned in. "I don't like your attitude," he growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble. "And I don't appreciate you thinking you're above the law just because you claim to be an FBI agent. You'd better start explaining yourself," and quickly the air between them was charged with palpable tension. Angela realized that this was no longer a simple traffic stop, it was a power struggle, and Henderson was determined to assert his dominance. His eyes blazed with barely contained anger as he moved even closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone brooking no refusal. Angela met his intense gaze with unwavering calm. "Sir, I've done nothing wrong." "There's no reason for me to step out of this car," she replied, her voice firm yet respectful. She was well aware of her rights and was determined not to be coerced into relinquishing them. Henderson's face twisted into a scowl of rage. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" he spat, his hand gripping the handle of her car door with white-knuckled intensity. Angela saw the fury in his eyes, the kind of fury that stemmed from his anger at being challenged by someone he perceived as inferior. "I'm not refusing anything," Angela said, her heart pounding heavily in her chest. "But I haven't broken any laws, and I don't see why you're insisting that I step out of the car." Henderson's anger flared even more, ignited by Angela's calm defiance. He was accustomed to people shrinking under his authority, not standing up to him, certainly not a black woman. The idea of someone challenging him, especially in this situation, was beyond what he could tolerate. His face flushed with rage and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the car door tighter. "I said step out of the car," he roared, his voice echoing through the night as the rain intensified, creating a suffocating atmosphere around them. Without giving her a chance to respond, Henderson yanked the door open, the force of it sending a shudder through the car. Angela's breath hitched as Henderson seized her arm, dragging her out of the vehicle with a violent force that made her stumble. The rain drenched her within moments, plastering her hair to her face and soaking through her clothes. Her instincts screamed at her to resist, to fight back, but she knew better. Any act of defiance would only escalate the situation. But she couldn't just let this happen. "Officer, you're making a mistake," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady even as she felt the roughness of his grip. Her words fell on deaf ears. Henderson was consumed by his fury, operating in a space where reason no longer held sway. "Shut up," he snapped, shoving her against the side of the car with a force that sent a sharp pain shooting through her shoulder. Angela winced but held her ground, determined to stay composed no matter how much it hurt. Henderson, still seething, pushed harder, his hands digging into her as he tried to pin her against the cold metal. The slick pavement beneath her feet and the weight of his aggression made it nearly impossible to maintain her balance. Angela had faced physical confrontations before, but this was different. It wasn't just about her being a federal agent, it was about the color of her skin and the power Henderson believed he had over her. As Henderson forced her down, Angela's purse slipped from her shoulder and hit the ground, spilling its contents onto the rain-soaked pavement. Lipstick, keys, and a few scattered papers lay in the puddles. But among the debris, something metallic and shiny caught the dim streetlight, a glint that caught Henderson's eye. He froze, his attention riveted to the object now lying on the wet ground. Angela's FBI badge, unmistakable in its authority, lay exposed before him. In that instant, the world seemed to pause. The rain, the wind, even the tension in the air, everything froze as the gravity of the situation hit him. Henderson's eyes locked onto the badge, and the realization of what he had just done began to dawn on him. His grip on Angela slackened, and the rage that had consumed him moments earlier drained away, replaced by shock and disbelief. Angela, still on the ground, looked up at him. She didn't say a word, just watched as the truth of his actions began to sink in. Henderson stumbled back, his face losing all color as the rain continued to pour down, a relentless reminder of the mess he'd created. His mouth moved, but no words came out. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and now it was Angela who held all the control. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her gaze never leaving Henderson's now terrified eyes. He was fumbling for words, desperate to explain himself, to undo what had been done, but it was too late. The damage was irreversible. "Your FBI," he stuttered, his voice barely more than a tremble. The bravado that had defined him moments ago was gone, replaced by a hollow fear. Angela didn't immediately respond. She calmly bent down, retrieved her badge from the ground, and wiped it off on her soaked hoodie. Holding it up for him to see, she met his gaze with a cold, firm stare. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "I am." Henderson's face contorted into a mix of fear, regret, and dawning horror. The realization of what he had done, assaulting a federal agent out of sheer prejudice, hit him with full force. He knew he was in deep trouble. The rain continued to fall, the only sound in the now eerily quiet, tension-charged night. As Henderson stared at the badge, its metallic surface gleaming under the dim streetlights, he felt the weight of his actions crush him. The aggression that had driven him mere moments ago was gone, leaving behind only a suffocating fear as he grasped the enormity of his mistake. Angela remained on the ground, the rain soaking through her clothes, but her eyes never wavered from Henderson's face. She watched closely as the transformation in his expression took place, how the anger and arrogance that had once hardened his features slowly gave way to fear and uncertainty. His initial confidence and sense of superiority drained away, leaving behind a man who was suddenly gripped by the terrifying realization of the consequences of his actions. Angela did not attempt to rise immediately, allowing Henderson to fully absorb the gravity of what he had done. Henderson's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, his thoughts racing in a desperate attempt to find the right words. I didn't know," he finally stammered, taking an unsteady step back. The voice that had been so commanding and harsh moments ago now trembled with insecurity and doubt. "You see, I didn't realize who you were." Slowly, Angela pushed herself up from the wet ground, her movements deliberate and controlled, never once breaking eye contact with Henderson. The rain dripped steadily from her hair, and her clothes clung to her body, but she stood tall and unwavering. Her presence now commanded even more authority than before, and she didn't need to say a word for Henderson to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Henderson's mind was in turmoil as he frantically searched for a way out of the mess he had created. "I thought you were someone else," he blurted out, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. "You weren't showing your ID, and you didn't comply. I was just doing my job." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow and inadequate. His excuses crumbled under the weight of the truth of what he had done. Angela's silence, her composed demeanor, was more damning than any accusation she could have made. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Henderson added, his voice now weak, almost pleading. He was desperate to justify his actions, to find some way to make what he had done seem less egregious. But as he looked into Angela's eyes, he saw that there was no justification. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. Angela finally spoke, her voice cold and steady, each word cutting through the night like a blade. "You didn't know because you didn't care," she said, her words piercing through Henderson's feeble defenses. "You saw what you wanted to see, a black woman who didn't belong here, and you acted on that without thinking, without questioning your prejudice." Henderson flinched at her words, the undeniable truth in them too powerful to ignore. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and defend himself, but nothing came out. The realization of what he had done and who he had done it to was sinking in deeper with every passing second. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. I was just trying to do my job," he repeated weakly, but even to his ears, the words sounded pathetic. Angela held up her badge, letting him see it clearly in the dim light. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and attack people based on the color of their skin," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury that made Henderson shrink back even more. "And you failed miserably." Henderson's hands trembled as he reached for his radio, unsure of what to do next. His entire career, his entire life, felt as though it was slipping through his fingers. He had made a grave mistake, one that could cost him everything, and he knew it. The fear of the impending consequences loomed over him like a dark cloud, more terrifying than anything he had faced before. Angela watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She understood that the power dynamic had shifted, that the tables had turned. But she also knew that this confrontation was far from over. As the rain continued to pour down, Angela felt a sense of clarity and purpose settle over her. She knew she had to carefully navigate the responsibility and authority now placed in her hands. Taking a deep breath, she stood up fully, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the pounding rain. She dusted off her soaked clothes, then bent down to retrieve her FBI badge from the wet pavement. The weight of the badge in her hand felt heavier now, symbolic of the power and responsibility she carried. She turned the badge over in her fingers before holding it up for Henderson to see, making it clear that his actions would not go unchallenged. "I'm Special Agent Angela Johnson, FBI," she declared, her voice carrying an undeniable authority. Each word was sharp and deliberate, slicing through the thick tension in the air. "And you've just made a serious mistake, Officer Henderson." Henderson's face lost all color as the reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. The confident facade he had worn earlier crumbled in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer panic. The image of Angela standing tall, her badge gleaming in the dim light, was a stark reminder of the power she wielded, a power he had grossly underestimated. He had tried to overpower her, to assert his dominance, but now the tables had turned. The power dynamics had shifted so drastically that it left him reeling. He knew, deep down, that he was in serious trouble, and his mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but he was too stunned to think clearly. "Look, I didn't know," Henderson stammered, his voice betraying his fear. "I didn't mean to, I thought you were someone else." His words were a weak attempt at justification, but they fell flat in the face of Angela's unwavering gaze. Her expression remained icy, her eyes boring into him with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," she replied, her tone calm yet laced with steel. "You saw me as a threat, not because I did anything wrong, but because of the color of my skin. You didn't even bother to ask questions or assess the situation. You just assumed." Henderson instinctively took a step back, his hands trembling as he tried to muster a defense. "I was just doing my job." "You weren't cooperating," he said, his voice growing more desperate. But Angela was having none of it. She cut him off with a piercing glare. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and attack innocent people," she retorted, her voice rising in intensity. "What exactly made you think I was a threat? Was it because I was driving through this town at night, or was it because I'm black and you didn't think I belonged here?" Henderson opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He knew there was no good answer to her questions, no justification that could excuse his actions. Angela didn't give him a chance to gather his thoughts. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him squirm. "This isn't just about you and me, officer," she continued, her voice low but powerful, each word dripping with conviction. "This is about the system that allows people like you to think it's okay to treat black people like criminals just because of the way we look. You think you're above the law, that you can do whatever you want without consequences, but you're wrong." Henderson swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his actions bearing down on him like a suffocating blanket. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." But Angela was unmoved by his apology. It was too little, too late. The damage was done, and there would be consequences that he could no longer avoid. "You'll have to explain that to your superiors," she said, her tone final, leaving no room for debate. "And you'll have to face the consequences of your actions. I'm reporting this incident, and I expect a thorough investigation." Henderson's shoulders slumped as the realization sank in. His defiance crumbled under the crushing weight of guilt and fear. He knew there was no escaping the fallout from what had happened. Angela, however, had already moved on in her mind. She turned away from him, the rain still pouring down around her, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt cleansing, washing away the remnants of the confrontation and leaving her with a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. As she walked away, she heard Henderson's shaky voice calling out to her, but she didn't turn back. She knew her fight wasn't over, but she also knew she had made a difference tonight, and that was worth all the rain in the world. In the final moments of their encounter, Angela saw the struggle in Henderson's eyes, the internal battle between the man he had been and the harsh truth he now faced. This was the moment to deliver a message he couldn't ignore. "Officer Henderson," she said, her voice calm but commanding, cutting through the storm of his thoughts. "This isn't just about tonight. It's about a system that has allowed you to hide behind your badge for too long, using it as a shield to act on your prejudices. But that ends now." Henderson flinched at her words, a visceral reaction he couldn't control, but his gaze remained locked on Angela. The truth in her words was like a scalpel, slicing away the last threads of his carefully constructed self-deception. Angela stepped closer, her voice unwavering, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Justice isn't about wielding power for personal gain. It's about fairness, equality, and protecting those who can't protect themselves. It's about upholding the law with integrity, not twisting it to suit your ends. Until you truly understand this, you're not a protector, you're just another man who hides behind a badge to mask his abuse of authority. You need to face the reality of who you are, Henderson, and make a choice: continue down this destructive path, or commit to the hard, painful work of change. Because if you don't, this job, this life, it will destroy you from the inside out." Her words crashed over him with the relentless force of a tidal wave, leaving him standing there in the pouring rain, drenched not just by the storm but by the cold, stark realization of what he had allowed himself to become. For the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his actions, and it threatened to bring him to his knees. Yet, he also knew that this was a moment of reckoning, one that he could no longer escape, no matter how much he might want to. The next morning, a suffocating tension hung over the police station like a dark cloud. The events of the previous night had spread through the department with the speed of wildfire, leaving the usual morning banter and camaraderie in ashes. As Henderson walked through the station doors, head bowed and steps heavy, he could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The familiar faces of his colleagues were now turned away, engaged in hushed conversations, their eyes avoiding his. The unspoken verdict was clear: they knew why he was there, and no one wanted to be the first to confront the reality of what had happened. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears as he was summoned to the chief's office. The air in the hallway felt thick, almost stifling, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him, amplifying the dread that coiled in his gut. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of pride and purpose, now felt like a leaden weight, a constant reminder of the reckoning he was about to face. As he entered the office, he saw the chief seated behind his desk, a man whose stern demeanor and years of hard-won experience were etched into every line of his face. Today, that face was an unreadable mask. "Take a seat," Henderson, the chief said, his voice stripped of the warmth and camaraderie they once shared. It was a command, not a request. Henderson obeyed, lowering himself into the chair with hands that shook ever so slightly. He knew what was coming, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "We've received a formal complaint from Special Agent Angela Johnson," the chief began, his tone professional but laced with a cold finality that chilled Henderson to the bone. "She's provided a detailed account of last night's events, and I've reviewed the body cam footage personally. The situation is serious, more serious than you might have realized." Henderson's mouth went dry, and he swallowed hard against the rising tide of dread. He had held on to a sliver of hope that perhaps things wouldn't be as bad as he feared, that there might be some way to mitigate the fallout. But as the chief's words sank in, that hope crumbled into dust. The chief slid a thick folder across the desk, its contents a damning testament to the gravity of the situation. Inside were printouts of news articles, headlines emblazoned with inflammatory words like racism, abuse of power, and FBI agent assaulted. As Henderson skimmed the pages, each headline was like a punch to the gut, the full extent of the damage laid bare before him. His stomach churned with a sickening lurch as he grasped the enormity of what he had done, not just the immediate consequences for himself, but the wider ripple effects that had already begun to spread through the department, the community, and beyond. The chief's gaze remained fixed on Henderson, his expression hard, devoid of sympathy. This incident has attracted significant attention, not just within the department but also in the media, the chief continued, his voice devoid of any trace of the empathy or understanding that might have once colored their conversations. We're under scrutiny, and the department's reputation is on the line. The consequences for you, for all of us, are going to be severe. Henderson felt the weight of those words presses down on him like a vice, squeezing the air from his lungs. There was no escaping this, no undoing what had been done. The only question that remained was what he would do next, and whether he had the strength to face the consequences of his actions. The department is now under intense scrutiny, the chief said, his tone laden with a profound sense of disappointment. And honestly, we cannot afford to allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a comprehensive investigation. Depending on the findings, you might face consequences beyond mere disciplinary action. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The word suspended reverberated in Henderson's mind, drowning out the chief's subsequent words, which seemed to fade into the background. His years of dedicated service, the reputation he had meticulously built, the authority he once wielded with such confidence, it was all collapsing around him. He was no longer the invincible figure he had once thought himself to be. As he rose to leave, the chief's voice halted him. "Mark," the chief said, and Henderson turned to see a flicker of something in the chief's eyes, perhaps pity. "I can't imagine how you're going to recover from this, but if you do manage to come back, you'd better be a changed man." Henderson nodded, his mind numb, unable to trust his voice to form words. He exited the office in a daze, the gravity of his situation settling in. Outside the station, a swarm of reporters had already gathered, their cameras flashing like a barrage of strobe lights as they caught sight of him. He tried to shield his face with his hand, attempting to block out the relentless onslaught of questions and accusations hurled in his direction. As he drove home, the town that had once felt so familiar now seemed hostile and alien. Faces that had once greeted him with respect now turned away in disdain, their eyes filled with judgment. Henderson could almost feel his reputation disintegrating, the respect he had commanded slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. It dawned on him that he was not merely confronting the fallout from a single poor decision, but was instead facing the cumulative consequences of a lifetime of choices that had led him to this precipice. For the first time, Henderson felt an overwhelming sense of solitude, isolated in a town that seemed to have turned its back on him. He knew, deep down, that he had no one to blame but himself. As he sat alone in his living room, the weight of his suspension felt like a physical burden pressing down on him. The once comforting silence of his home now seemed stifling, haunted by the echoes of Angela's words and the painful realization of his failings. He could no longer escape the harsh truth. He was entrenched in a toxic system that had permitted him to act with unchecked authority, to view individuals like Angela with suspicion and contempt solely because of their race. He had always prided himself on being a staunch defender of the law, someone who upheld justice. Yet now those convictions seemed hollow and empty. He had wielded his badge not to protect, but to dominate and assert power over those he feared or misunderstood. In doing so, he had betrayed everything he once believed he stood for. Angela's voice echoed relentlessly in Henderson's mind, her words replaying over and over, as if on an endless loop. "This isn't just about you losing your job. This is about changing the way people like you think and act." Her challenge was not just a condemnation of his professional failings, but a deep, unflinching reflection of the prejudice and narrow-mindedness he had long ignored. Henderson understood that confronting this harsh reality was not merely an option but a necessity. If he chose to ignore this mirror into his soul, he would be condemned to perpetuate the same errors, continuing down a path that only led to greater harm and deeper regret. Yet, the prospect of change was daunting. It demanded that he acknowledge his deep-seated errors that struck at the core of his beliefs about himself and his role in the world. It required a fundamental reassessment of everything he had been taught and everything he had held to be true. Embracing change meant embarking on a grueling journey of self-improvement, a path fraught with discomfort and the relentless challenge of becoming someone better, someone more aligned with the principles of justice and equality. Henderson wrestled with the fear of this transformation, unsure if he possessed the strength to face it. The weight of guilt was heavy, but the fear of stepping into the unknown was paralyzing. Amidst the guilt and fear, there was a fragile, persistent glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, that he could learn from this experience and emerge as a better man, a better officer. He clung to the hope that redemption might be within reach, despite knowing that it would require immense effort and courage. Redemption, after all, was never easy. In parallel, Angela continued her tireless work, her resolve hardened by her encounter with Henderson. The incident only reaffirmed her commitment to confronting injustice and dismantling the systems that allowed racism and abuse of power to flourish. Angela was acutely aware that Henderson was merely one part of a much larger issue, and her determination to push for accountability and systemic reform was undeterred. Her focus remained steadfastly on the broader mission to ensure that what had happened to her would not befall anyone else. As days turned into weeks, Henderson found himself at a pivotal juncture. He faced a choice: the path of retreat, marred by bitterness and blame, or the arduous journey of self-reflection, growth, and potential redemption. The decision before him would shape the trajectory of his life, defining not only his future but also his legacy. The path he chose would determine whether he would succumb to the ease of resentment or rise to the challenge of personal transformation and integrity. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as I did. Reflecting on Angela's experience, what lessons or insights have stood out to you so far? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share one key takeaway or something you plan to apply to your own life in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us continue creating meaningful content.